And then I think what we see in the restoration, in the metaphor of the restoration of senses, as well as in the other metaphors in Second Isaiah, is also that restoration of communal agency.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's interview is Eric J. Harvey. We'll be discussing his article, Not Seeing, Unseeing, and Blind, Disentangling Disability from Adjacent Topoi in the Hebrew Bible. I won't spend a lot of time setting this up, because I think the author of something like this will always do a better job than I can at explaining their work. I will say I appreciate how he opens up avenues of understanding biblical text that will allow people to think maybe outside of what they consider normal as it applies to physical bodies and disabled bodies, and maybe how people can associate with one another and be in community without marginalizing others. So I wonder what the potential for inviting others into community is with an approach to biblical texts like his. And so without further ado, here's my conversation with Eric J. Harvey. Eric J. Harvey, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Before we get going with the conversation, can you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, my name is Eric Harvey, and currently I'm on a fellowship writing a book about blindness in the ancient Middle East. I graduated with my PhD in Hebrew Bible and the Ancient Near East from Brandeis in 2020, right at the very beginning of the pandemic. And since then, I've been hopping from thing to thing. I've done a postdoc at Stanford and then this fellowship, and working on getting some of my work out there. So I appreciate the opportunity to come talk about it. I'm also blind, which obviously informs this work. I never intended to be the blind guy doing blind research, but it spun out of my dissertation when I started interpreting some texts and realized I had something to contribute to this conversation that most other scholars don't. So that's where this stream of research came from.
You also have a blog, right? Your personal blog.
Yeah, I have a blog, www.blindscholar.com. No spaces or hyphens or underscores. And yeah, I put a bunch of stuff on there, my book reviews, personal thoughts, my reading list, as well as any sorts of pieces I feel like putting out in the world on a more casual basis than going through all of the rigmarole of academic publishing and peer review and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I was just at SBL and there was a lot of talk about that, the conversations that I had.
Yeah.
There was a lot of people explaining to me why they wanted to go yell at this or that publisher for something they experienced with them.
There's a lot to say for the process of academic publishing, but it's, as scholars, I think we need to be doing not only that, but that and other types of publishing to get the word out in different ways.
Yeah. Hey, that's why I'm having you guys on here. That's mostly academics on here. So I'll try to have a link to your blog in the show notes for people. So don't worry about remembering that URL. You can click through on the show notes. So the conversation we're having today is about your Journal of Biblical Literature article, Not Seeing, Unseeing, and Blind, Disentangling Disability from Adjacent Topoi in the Hebrew Bible. First of all, did I say, is it topoi, topoi? How should I say that?
I say topoi. Yeah, topoi, it's from the Greek word for a place or a location. Okay. So you find it in English words like utopia and topography.
Got it.
And it's in this, you can think of it as roughly synonymous with a topic, or if you think of a conceptual landscape, it's like an area on that landscape that's distinguishable from other sorts of ideas and concepts.
Okay. You covered question number 2 on my list. But as far as I think getting into this conversation, as I was reading, the angle of entry that I found that I thought would be helpful is, will you please explain the substantive differences between the categories and the title of your article? And I can restate those if you'd like, but it's your call.
Yeah, no, the 3 are not seeing, unseeing, and blind. And this came out of actually some work on textual transmission that I was doing in my dissertation, where I was dealing with sort of this iconic biblical couplet. They have eyes but do not see. They have ears but do not hear. And this shows up 5 times in the Hebrew Bible in varying forms with a little bit of variation. But I realized as I was doing this work that while they kept the form of the line intact, the meanings are very different. And yet, interpreters have often understood them all to be discussing disability in some way. So that's the subtitle, Disentangling Disability from these Adjacent Topoi. But what are the adjacent topoi? The first one is not seeing. And when you think about not seeing, there are any number of reasons why a person could not see something, right? Blindness is one of them, but people who are normally sighted miss things for various reasons all the time. I have a 5-year-old who can't find anything she sets down, and so I'm constantly, Daddy, where's this? And it's right there. And she, oh, I didn't see it, right? So she can see perfectly well, but she misses things. And you find this, the not seeing motif, most often in sort of moral ethical condemnations, right? This is when a prophet says, y'all are doing something wrong and you're not getting it. So not only is not seeing not linked specifically to being blind, but actually as a moral critique, it's logically incoherent with a disability like blindness, right? So if you are criticizing someone for not seeing, it only makes sense as a criticism if they have the capacity to see, right? Because if somebody writes me a note and puts it on a sticky note on the door and then gets mad at me for not doing what they asked, that doesn't make sense, because unless they put it in Braille in a place where I'll encounter it, there's no way I could have seen it to do what it said. Whereas when the prophets are talking to the people of Israel and Judah and saying, you have eyes to see, but you don't see, they're clearly saying, you are capable of seeing. You have the faculty, and yet you're not doing it. You're not only not seeing, you're not receiving the message or interpreting the world around you correctly, but you're not taking the responsive action. So that's the not seeing motif. Unseeing is a little bit different. And this motif you find in descriptions of the statuaries of foreign deities that are being mocked or denigrated by the biblical author. You see these several places where prophets will point out that the statues of foreign gods can't do things like see, smell, hear, eat, talk, etc. But the 2 lines where I look at them are in the Psalms. It's actually in this parallel passage where it says, the idols of the nations are silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have mouths but do not speak. They have eyes but do not see. They have ears but do not hear. They have no breath in their mouths. And here, it's not a metaphor in the same way that not seeing is in the prophetic critiques, because these are statues, and the prophet's whole point is literally that they can't see at all. They are made of metal and stone, and the prophet is arguing that there is no real divine presence behind these statues, that they're just dead lumps of matter, right? Lifeless lumps of matter. And so I distinguish this also from disability, because disability, as I understand it, and as I define it in the piece based on a lot of work in disability studies, is a deviant, a form of lived embodiment that's identified and classified by a given society as deviant or abnormal. It requires life to be a coherent concept. Disability does. Furthermore, when you're calling these statues unseeing, when you're saying they can't see, this is all building up to a greater critique, which is that they're lifeless. And so calling on them, worshiping them and calling on them in times of trouble is pointless and useless. It's farcical in the eyes of these Psalms. And if you're equating this kind of unseeingness with the lived disability of blindness, that is, in a sense, drawing blindness into a conversation where it doesn't belong and adding extra stigma to the already stigmatized identity of blindness. So those two are different from the disability of blindness, which does show up in this line in a slightly variant form in the book of Isaiah, where, the author of the second section of that book, which we refer to as Second Isaiah, although there's absolutely no reason to assume that the author's name was actually Isaiah. But he's talking to the community of exiled Judeans in Babylonia at or near the end of the Babylonian exile. And he says, bring out the people who are blind so they have eyes, who are deaf so they have ears. And here, instead of saying that they don't see, like in the previous examples, he actually uses the Hebrew word for blind, iver, and the Hebrew word for deaf, perish. And these are very clearly disability terms. So it's clear that Isaiah then is doing something different in actually invoking disability. And I worked that out in the third part of my paper. But I've just gone on for a long time, so I'm going to let you pop in with any questions, and if there's anything I can clarify or build out on from there.
Look, I had you here to talk, so you talk as long as you want. So I do have a question, but first I'll call out specifically the passages you deal with. There's 5 passages. So it's Jeremiah 5:21, Ezekiel 12:2, Psalms 115, 5b through 6a, and 135, 16b through 17a. And then the passage in Isaiah is 43:8. I'm just giving that out there for the listeners in case we don't camp out on any or all of those for too long. Because no, it's fine. But now I just have to do less typing in the show notes, which I'm always worried I'm going to forget something, or like, how many hyperlinks can I fit in this area? So I guess my question is, how do you see the motivation of interpreting passages that have nothing to do with the disability of blindness as though they are talking about blindness? Or is it a motivated thing, or is it just something that people fall into because there's like a symmetry between, not seeing, blind people don't see? How does that work?
And I think that's something I'm really trying to tease out in my larger project. Is, I said earlier, disability is logically incompatible with moral critique. But linguistic usage doesn't care at all about logical compatibility, right? And if you think about English usage specifically, we use disabilities all the time to represent character flaws or ethical shortcomings or immoral behavior or any sort of chosen behavior, right? We just throw around disability like nobody's business. And as a blind person, it's striking that people often stumble over when they meet you asking a question like, are you blind? Which is a simple question, but 90% of the time in modern English, if you're asking someone, are you blind? You're not asking them if they're blind, you're accusing them of something, right? Are you blind? So there is a sense in which that sort of logical incompatibility is really escapes our notice a lot of the time because it is so common. And we talk about turning a blind eye or falling on deaf ears or blind rage or being crippled by something. All of these things, we are very used to making that sort of logical misstep that's very common in actual usage. As I looked back into ancient texts, I found in the Hebrew Bible, that is a lot less common, very uncommon. And so I started looking around for where did this come from? And I looked over into Mesopotamian texts where it's almost entirely absent. The use of disability as a metaphor in Mesopotamian texts is just vanishingly rare. I've found one example of a text using blindness as a disability and one example of a text using deafness as a disability metaphor. Otherwise, they're very literal about it. And yet, then you look on the other side where you get to the Second Temple period, New Testament times, and you can think of New Testament texts where, Jesus, for example, is interpreting Isaiah, is riffing on Isaiah, but really leans into blindness rather than one of the other top way of not seeing or unseeing. That is, like when he criticizes people for being blind guides, or when the blind lead the blind, will they not both fall into a pit? Simple answer, no. But like rhetorically, by the time of the New Testament, those are accepted and expected and understood ways of talking about disability and ethics. And so I'm working on this as a work in progress, because there's a lot of influences that come in by the time of the New Testament in terms of Greek and Roman influence from those conquests, and the growth of different literary and linguistic movements. I mean, you do also see this in a very nascent way in the Hebrew Bible. There are a few examples of places where blindness is used as a metaphor for sort of voluntary oversight of something. So there's, I forget the exact verse, I think it's Deuteronomy. I'm not going to say it because I'll get it wrong. But there's a parallel verse in Exodus, in the Covenant Code, and the Deuteronomy, where you have a prohibition against taking bribes. And it says, you shall not take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes. And in the earlier text, it says, a bribe blinds the eyes of the sighted. And in the second, it says, a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise. So clearly here, it's not a suggestion that taking a bribe literally leads to blindness, but rather that taking a bribe leads whoever's in charge of a given case or situation to overlook important evidence or activities or whatever in favor of the person who gave the bribe. So you do have that emerging in a very small way in the Hebrew Bible, but it's nowhere near as prevalent as it is even in the Greek language literature of the Second Temple period, early Christianity, or as we are comfortable with in modern English. I think a lot of it in modern interpretation just comes from how comfortable we are with it in modern English, and how used we are to making those easy conflations between not being able to see or not seeing and blindness, that such that in many ways they function synonymously, even though logically they don't serve as synonyms.
So the idea then is, I think you've already mentioned it, but the normate bodies. So using as a metaphor in everyday speech, the idea that I guess you're not seeing it then. I know anytime I'm in a store, because I don't pay attention all the time, if I'm asking for something, if I ask for help, and I do sometimes, I'll say it might be there. It's just sometimes I don't pay attention. So I can get the idea, this person didn't notice a thing that was right in front of them, linking that to eyes not working in the way that we expect that they should. Is there how do I put this? I don't know. I have very recently been exposed to the idea that there is such a thing as disability studies at all. So I know hearing the idea that maybe accommodation isn't enough, right? To have people be a part of the community. But the idea, it is difficult for the sighted, or difficult for those of us who can hear, to not think of people who are blind or who are deaf as anything other than needing our help in a way that they have some kind of a deficit. So is this interpretation based on a way of thinking that says there's a normative world, there's a world we should accept and understand, and you use the word deviant, so there are deviations from that norm? Sorry, I'm just mostly thinking out loud.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I think, I think, so you mentioned the concept of the normate body, and this is a concept developed by Rosemary Garland Thompson in her book, Extraordinary Bodies, it came out in 1997, but in my book is still one of the most illuminating disabilities studies texts out there, and I think everybody should read it. Rosemary Garland Thompson there, and she's building off of existing work in disability studies. Disability studies really did not originate in the academy. It came in through sort of academic attempts to develop and theorize activist work. The organized blind movement started in the 1940s, and then in the 1960s, there was these key broader disability rights movements. There was UPS in the UK, which I think stands for the Union of Physically Impaired Against Segregation, who were working for integrated work for disabled people in society. And they came up with this formulation that it is not our bodies that cause many of the problems we encounter in society, but the prejudices of society, right? And this sort of initiated this what's called the social model of disability, as opposed to what's called the medical model. And this was articulated in the early 80s by Mike Oliver in his book, The Politics of Disablement. And basically, that makes the shift from disability is an inherent quality of the disabled person. And as Rosemary Garland Thompson says later, that disability is a necessary physical condition, a transparent tragedy. That is, that like all of the hardships of disability are caused by the disability itself, and thus the solution to disability or the problems disabled people face in society is to cure their bodies, to bring their bodies into alignment with the assumed norm in society. Rosemary Garland Thompson, in her book, coins this term, the normate, which is, she defines as the wholly unmarked body. And by marked, she means you can think of any physical trait, any behavior trait, psychological trait that is marked as not normal, right? And you can think of these in many different ways. This, of course, differs across culture, right? If you think of yourself imagining just a person, or if you think of yourself as a casting director in a movie, casting a person, just a random person who you don't want anything about how they appear on screen or they're heard or they speak to signal anything to the audience. For example, chances are, if you picture this a random person in the United States, chances are you picture the first person that pops to mind for most people is a male, specifically a white male, in young to middle-aged, physically healthy, not disabled, probably with what they call the media neutral accent, not a strong Southern or Boston accent. This is what's set up as the norm without marked character traits like disability or racialization or non-dominant gender, right? It's just basic person. And of course, as Rosemary Garland Thompson draws out, the normate person, even though it's the assumed norm, it's what we think of when we're designing a system. It is actually the minority of people, because any given real human, while they probably don't hold most marked identity traits or physical characteristics, they probably hold one or two, right? So if we hold that the normate is gendered male, that's half of society already who is not fitting that category. If it's a white man, then like everyone who is racialized as non-white, it doesn't no longer fits in that category. If you think of disabilities, right, most people are sighted, but many sighted people can be hard of hearing or have a chronic illness or have a limb difference and be disabled in another way. So the number of people in society who actually fit the normate category by having no marked characteristics is a pronounced minority. But that's who we assume when we're designing systems, when we're building the built environment, etc. And so Rosemary Garland Thompson calls it the phantom majority, because we act like this is most people, but in reality, it is a minority of people. Does that make sense? Is that clear enough? I feel like I could be a little clearer there.
And at the end, you mentioned something that my brain first went to: architecture. So architecture for the longest time, maybe the last 50 years, I don't remember exactly when the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, but the idea of ramps on buildings, like that was a
Mm-hmm.
costly and opposed, like deeply opposed endeavor, because
Mm-hmm.
that's not how we do things. But architecture is a cultural artifact. And as a
Yep.
cultural artifact, people made decisions. Now, eventually, when you fold the cheese in, it becomes a part of it's one ingredient in the dish that you're making,
Mm-hmm.
but you keep
Mm-hmm.
folding it in and folding it in. So the language that we use, the buildings that we build, the way that we approach things, just the fact of you can't just let a blind person walk around the world. Why? They might get hit by a car. Those are things that we made, and we have actually accommodated to motor vehicles being able to operate in places where people used to
Mm-hmm.
walk. So these are all decisions that were made. And I think leading us back to the interpretations that you brought up, which I was even thinking about the folding analogy as you were talking about that. Who knows how those things got into English language or
Yeah.
English thinking? They may have come from a misunderstanding of this, and then it just becomes reified. Is that
Yeah.
so? I've been
Now
rambling.
that's funny because that's actually, I use a very similar metaphor, like folding in the whipped egg whites into waffle batter. And I think of that
I
in
was
terms
thinking
of,
of Schitt's Creek. You fold the cheese in. Well, how do
oh,
I fold that? I don't know. You just fold it, David. Sorry. Only my wife would appreciate that joke if I didn't
well,
explain it.
here's a design issue. I've tried to watch Schitt's Creek, but it does not have audio description. So if anybody out there wants to describe audio Schitt's Creek, then
Which is more to our point that they
right,
have
exactly.
fallen into the trap of why do that? This is a visual medium.
Yeah, I have lots to say on this. There's two books. Bess Williamson's Accessible America is a great look at design as it relates to disability. And then Sarah Hendren's What Can a Body Do? Likewise, what you mentioned, this idea that like retrofitting buildings and building accessible things is too much, too expensive. It's called the access is excess model, which is something we all need to be resisting. But that takes us a little further afield from the topic of this interview. And I think, yes, so the Hebrew Bible operates with an implicit concept of the normate. And in my article, I don't try to totally vindicate the Hebrew Bible of ableism. I say there's definitely ableism in there. It's just been, its character has been misrecognized, and also it has been added to via, as you said, this iterative process of communal interpretation and reinterpretation that acts like folding the egg whites into the waffle batter, right? It's such that for many people who grow up in Bible reading communities, communal interpretation becomes identified and flated with the biblical text itself, such that the egg whites, which were once separate, becomes mixed into their understanding of what the Bible is and said originally. The point of this article is really to say, to try and get the egg whites out of the waffle batters, which when I say it like that doesn't sound like a hopeful proposition, but to say basically, when these texts were written, that folding hadn't happened yet. And so the ableism that's present in the biblical text, and here is where we can talk about Second Isaiah if you want, but the ableism that's present in the text is a little more muted and more limited in its scope than the ableism that has been folded into the text over the millennia of interpretation.
I do want to get to Second Isaiah, but I understand we're going with the folding in thing, but I think a better approach might be to say, rather than getting something out of the interpretation, starting over and admitting maybe this wasn't the best approach. Maybe this wasn't the right way. That maybe engaging with biblical texts as a community needs to encompass as many of the people in the community as possible, because that would apply to anyone who touches biblical texts in any of those iterations. And some have done it better than others. But where are we falling short? Let's start making the batter again. That's okay. There's components of the flour that you need to have in it, but maybe we don't need to fold these egg whites like this anymore. But look, I'm going to let you be free range on Second Isaiah, because you are the biblical studies expert, and I just want to listen to you.
Yeah. All right. So let's dive into second Isaiah. If people aren't familiar with sort of the critical scholarship on the book of Isaiah, you look in your Bible, there's no second Isaiah, there's a second Kings. And yet we talk about second and even third Isaiah in critical scholarship for several reasons. If the book of Isaiah, as it exists in the Bible, 66 books long, the first part is really linked to this prophetic figure of Isaiah with pronounced narrative elements that are located in the 8th century BCE. He is dealing with problems that existed in that century of invasion by the Assyrians. He's interacting with kings like his, and so that part of the book, in its majority, not entirely, is really rooted in 8th century events. Then you get into, especially starting in chapter 40, where you get this famous sort of introduction of a voice crying out in the wilderness, something that seems totally different. And you have in there actually references to historical figures that weren't born until several centuries after the time in which the narratives about the prophetic figure Isaiah are located in the 8th century. So you have mentions of Cyrus of Persia, who was a 6th century BCE king of Persia, who participated in the conquest of Babylon from the east and the return of the Judeans in Babylonia from their exile. Critical scholars realize, wait a second, this is different. The whole tone of this section is different. The language is different. There are definite through lines in the book, but it's clear that this second part of the book is located in a different historical frame than the first. And then what many scholars also believe that there's a third section. So the first Isaiah, regular Isaiah, usually goes from chapter 1 to 39. Second Isaiah goes from 40 to 55, with the understanding that there are a few passages in first Isaiah that were also part of that second Isaiah work and were just added in to the earlier section of the narrative later. And then there's a third Isaiah that goes from 56 to 66. Understanding this real long time span of the book of Isaiah is key to understanding what some of the texts mean and what they're doing. So the second Isaiah, which are all the texts that I deal with are in second Isaiah, and really specifically at the beginning of that from mostly in chapters 42 and 43. This section, it occurs right at the end, either anticipating the end of the Babylonian exile or right at the moment where the Persians take over Babylon, and it's clear that the Judeans are, that the exilic situation is going to change and return is possible. And so this section is all about return and revitalization and rejuvenation. And this is described through a lot of different kinds of metaphors in these chapters. So you get these descriptions of an arid desert that suddenly bursts into bloom. You get these descriptions of like hard paths that are rough terrain that's made into straight paths. And you get these descriptions of disability, which is suddenly reversed. And all of these are dancing around the same reality for the composer of second Isaiah, which is that, in a sense, the exile, when the Judeans were captured and forcibly relocated and resettled in Babylonia, this is likened to a fallow period or a period of sort of retrenchment, of pulling back, of death, of aridness, of roughness, of imprisonment, of captivity, of disability, and that the end of exile represents the reversal of all of this and the beginning of a new life, a new period of vibrancy. So the disability passage that I look at, when the scene is reminiscent of a legal court where the people are called out to witness to the testimony of God, who, because part of the task of this section is not only to say like we're on the cusp of a new beginning, but also has to prove that God was in control of what was happening with the exile and is capable of bringing them to that new beginning. A lot of this is sort of God saying, I was doing this all on purpose, and I am more powerful than the gods of Babylon, etc. In this section, you have bring out the people who are blind, they have eyes, bring out the people who are deaf, they have ears, to witness to this testimony. Earlier in the passage, you have, in the previous chapter, chapter 42, you have this section where there's this call that says, look up, you blind, and see, listen, you deaf, and hear. And this has been read in a lot of different ways, but I read it as a performative act that institutes the restoration of senses, right? That the end of exile is being likened to having senses restored after a period of disability. And this, in the end, I say this is not ableist, right? It's still linking disability with a deficit in the ability to receive or gain knowledge and to take, to have proper moral discernment and understanding. But I understand it also as ableist in a slightly different way than the common moral critiques that we are used to as English speakers, right? That what it's saying, in a sense, it's likening disability to a form of captivity, to a form of immobility. And this specifically with blindness is clear because blindness in the Hebrew Bible is understood more as a navigational disability than an informational disability, right? So you get the blind all mentioned alongside the lame much more often than you have the blind mentioned alongside the deaf. And it's clear that this is because blindness was seen more as an impediment to travel than to reading, which is much less common. That where I end up is that this text in Isaiah isn't criticizing the people for being blind, or it's not using blindness as a moral critique, but instead what it's doing is it's adopting this position of paternalistic concern. That is, that it's identifying blindness and deafness as pitiable conditions that are remedied by this sort of restorative, curative action on the part of the deity, as a metaphor for the end of exile and a new beginning where agency and action and proper worship are once again possible. There's a sense in which, for Isaiah, these things weren't even possible during the exile because it was such a time of a season of death, right? Of not of growth, of trying to think of the word that I want to use here, and I'm struggling. But it's a winter, it's a fallow period, or a hot summer in the desert where things just don't grow and nothing is happening. This is just a chastening that has to have its time fulfilled, and then at the end, things are restored to normal, or even better than normal, and they're allowed to go back to Judea to start again with the capacity for proper actions, right? Not the guarantee of it, which shows up again in the later chapters of Isaiah, that things aren't necessarily going as well as anticipated, but the capacity to engage in proper worship and proper adherence to the divine order of things.
And God is the main player that we see in this passage.
Yeah.
It's probably important to say, okay, so there's a reference to blindness, deafness, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. These are things that are going to be, there's restoration is going to be made, but everything from the captivity to deliverance from the captivity, these are things that God is responsible for, right?
Yeah.
So
that's the case that's being made, because the fall of Jerusalem in 587 BCE was truly huge crisis, right? It shook, it seems, a lot of people's faith in their God to the core, that this sort of defeat and exile and resettlement was possible, suggests that the God who's supposed to be taking care of them is not actually in control of history. And so part of the case that's being made in 2nd Isaiah is strongly making the case that no, God was doing this all the time. And this ties back texts in 1st Isaiah, in the famous scene where the prophet goes up to the court of the Lord in heaven in Isaiah 6. And God tells him to plaster over the eyes and fill up the ears, stop the ears, and fatten the hearts of the people so that they won't receive a message and repent and forestall the punishment that's coming to them. And so I also read that as leading into this disability trope. But in that passage in Isaiah 6, there's not disability. It's plaster on the eyes and stopping the ears and fattening the hearts. This is an external imposition on the senses, right? It's linked, but it's a development on that earlier theme in Isaiah.
And with Isaiah 43:8, do you think, given the disability language that we have here, if what we're looking at is not individuals as moral actors necessarily as the center of the story here, does that matter?
I think there's definitely, because it's, in a sense, we're talking about a collective being disabled, right? And there's also a sense of God is the main actor here. Right before that section in chapter 2, where look up, you blind, and see, look up, listen, you deaf and hear. There's this verse talking about the return from Babylonia that says, the Lord will lead the blind by paths they did not know, but the idolaters will be turned back in shame. And so there's also this sense of paternalistic concern, of compassion, and of being led, right? Like there's a passivity imputed to the people here that is, at this point in their communal life, I don't think they are being understood as even a real communal agent, right? Everything here is just playing out. And then I think what we see in the restoration, in the metaphor of the restoration of senses, as well as in the other metaphors in 2nd Isaiah, is also that restoration of communal agency.
Because I'm thinking that thing that people do where they'll read one passage. So I think it was in the Gospels, but I don't remember where. Who sinned? Was it him or his parents?
Mm-hmm.
And they'll interpret other passages. And I don't know how much that factors into what you see as far as like an ableist. It's not really a term that we've used much in this conversation, but ableist interpretive scheme or approach to biblical texts. But that's why I was thinking, if the center of the conversation here is the divine actor is doing all of this, is the center of the story, individual moral actors are not. And that is very difficult as a narrative for, I think, contemporary Western Christian, or possibly even Jewish, I don't know, but I know more about Christians than I do Jewish people, as far as their understanding that everything is about an individual's actions as a moral agent. And that's not what we're seeing here.
There's massive troubling elements to the whole Isaianic span, right? You start in Isaiah 6, where you have the deity saying to Isaiah, make sure they don't have enough knowledge to repent, because then they might repent and I wouldn't get to punish them. And I'm going to punish them. So make sure they can't repent. And then Isaiah says,
this is the God Jonah wanted the entire time, right?
Right. There you go. Jonah would have been like, yeah. No. And then Isaiah's like, how long will this persist? And God says, until the city is laid in ruins and the countryside is laid waste. That is troubling to any sort of sensibility that wants to have a individualistic religious meritocracy, right? Where you have this disagreement really surfaced in Jeremiah and Ezekiel as well, where you have them arguing over this proverb that the older generation eats sour grapes and the younger's teeth are put on edge. Do we believe in intergenerational punishment, intergenerational collective punishment? And the prophets disagree on this. And I don't think there's, in that sense, any resolution. It depends on which text you're reading. And I think that was a live and active debate within ancient Israel religion as well as early Judaism.
I think this falls into a category of a lot of other things in biblical texts where Jonathan Edwards is the first one that comes to mind, but I know he described this idea of a perfect, completely independently satisfied God out there that needs nothing and does things just because to satisfy mysterious ends, whereas this is not a quiet, eternally at peace divinity represented here. This is anger that is for a period, setting conditions, things like that. I don't mean to rain on anybody's parade, but this is not the disembodied eternal. The word passive keeps coming to mind, but it's not passive, but just like an internally satisfied divinity. This divinity is
disinterested.
concerned.
Yeah.
Yes, those are better words. Thank you.
And I think there's a category of theological beliefs that I classify as, unless you bring them to the text with you as interpretive aids, you're not going to leave the text with them. And it's clear unless you really read the text with those sorts of theological ideas as strong interpretive constraints, that is, that the text must align with them. The texts usually don't support them, right? Even you can get that idea from Genesis 1, but then you head into Genesis 2, and it's a very different situation where God is sort of creating and reacting on the fly, and very much a different flavor to creation. And then you get into, as you go on in the primeval history, then you have God regretting things in terms of creating human beings and bringing the flood, and then regretting the flood, and then worrying about the tower in Babylon, and then all of these things where you have God demonstrating changeability of motivation, of will, of opinion. And then you also do have texts where you have these rhetorical questions like, is God a man that he changes his mind? And yet you also have texts in the same anthology that say God changed his mind. And so this is where the anthological nature of the Bible is really important, right? Because the Bible is not a systematic theology text, and we're reading multiple sides of live and active debates about what this God is and what this God wants and what this God wants to do. And depending on who you're reading within the anthology of the Bible and where they were and what they were reacting to and what their goals were, you get different views of the nature of God. So not all of those are palatable to our modern sensibilities, conditioned by whatever modern context we were conditioned by, right?
But I think this could serve as a pretty good bookend to where we started the conversation, which is cultural artifacts being brought to a text to interpret it should not be as important as the context, which I think for almost everyone is the community that they read the text within. This is another thing. I was having a conversation with some friends of mine Sunday or Saturday, whatever, I don't know. And I was saying the idea that there's a thing sitting in your lap or on your desk or table or whatever that you're reading as an individual it does not fit the history of biblical texts. It's fine. Read it on your own. Great. But if you understand that to be the starting point, you're going to be much more willing, I think, to accept some things that maybe you shouldn't. Because if you're reading it in a community and you're trying to fit people in your community, I think what that turns into is more trying to read with core values rather than conclusions in mind. And if I may, pivot to, so because we're approaching an hour, I know you didn't have a hard out, but if we bust an hour, I want to make sure we cover as much as possible. Is there anything in the article that we didn't go over that you wanted covered?
No, I think we hit the basics. Yeah, I think in the list of questions you gave me, you got into some questions about embodiment and corporeality that might be fun to discuss real quick. Just in
By all
terms
means.
of, there are these questions that you asked about if God is transcending materiality in these anti-idol texts. And I wanted to talk about the embodiment of God as it relates to some of these questions around disability. Because I think this is another area in which many, particularly Christian theological concepts, smack up against the Bible in an uncomfortable way. In Christian contexts, it's very common to talk about God as an immaterial, invisible deity of pure spirit or something like that. The Hebrew Bible has a very corporeal view, embodied view of God. And so there's a sense in which God doesn't transcend materiality, but definitely transcends the limits of human embodiment. When you're talking about what animates matter and what's not animating these statues, then you can see in the Hebrew Bible different kinds of animation, right? Where the classic you can think of in the garden when God breathes the breath of life into the first human's nose. So animated by breath. But then you have these other situations like 2 Kings 6, where you have these sort of heavenly transmundane beings that are made of fire. So they're animated, they have bodies, but their bodies are made of fire. And so when you bring broader classes of beings into this conversation about bodily ideals and deviance, it can lead you to think in interesting ways about what an ideal body is and for whom. And the question of what animates God's body is open. There have been some good articles about the role of fire in God's body, as well as different substances that are involved in the conversation about the corporeality of God. But there's something there that clearly participates in, but also calls into question elements of human bodily ideals that I think is interesting.
Look, I have so much curiosity about materiality in the Bible. And honestly, it began, I think, when I was 17 years old and I first became exposed to the idea that 1 Corinthians 15 is talking about the substance of bodies. And it's not a non-corporeal, some ethereal other. It is, the word terrestrial floated around in my head for years until very recently when I talked to Haley Gabriel about a passage in Galatians, and it was material, that it's a material thing, that even breath, so translating pneuma as spirit, it might be deceptive. It might be confusing when you start to develop a theology around spirit rather than breath, because if you're talking about flesh or breath is still a material thing. And I understand we're talking about the Hebrew Bible, but that at 17 being exposed to 1 Corinthians 15, and even I think it's David Burnett, I saw him give a paper at SBL, and hopefully I'll be able to have him on, but talking about the substance of stars and how that was understood in the ancient world. I have a lot of curiosity about that, but if I'm not careful, which I was today, I will turn the entire conversation into my attempt to develop some kind of a systematic theology around materiality. And I don't want it to be that. I don't want it to be that, but I did think that the lifelessness, it's so far removed from disability, because disability is it's a material thing, but also we're talking about life. I think a lot of people maybe have this spirituality or eschatology that wants to erase disability, that at the eschaton, that in the age to come, there won't be disability, but will there be material embodiment if there isn't? That's a thing that I think people need to grapple with. And are they just making an excuse for a world they already live in? So aren't you just excusing the current evil age, if you want to separate things apocalyptically? You see what I'm saying? You did
Yeah.
this. Look, you
We didn't
put a
even
nickel
get
in me.
we didn't even get into the eschatological passages in Isaiah that I also have disability related thoughts on, but those
I
might
will
have to wait for
bother you.
another time.
Yes, I will bother you about. I tell you what, if you start working on one of those, just hit me up and we will record a conversation before they're even published.
Okay.
I guess you can start with this area, but with biblical studies broadly, where would you recommend people go?
Yeah, so I think if you're interested in topics of bodies and disability, there's been a lot of great work in this over the last 20 years. A nice place to start is Rebecca Raphael's book, Biblical Corpora. I forget what the subtitle is, but it has something about disability in there. And that's a nice overview of a lot of text. She covers a lot of ground and does it well. We're looking at thoughts on bodies more generally. There's Benjamin Sommer's The Bodies of God is a great place to start. And there's a new book for biblical non-specialists that's a very entertaining read and also a lot of good info by Francesca Stavrokopoulou called God and Anatomy.
It's a good one.
Yeah. And then because of where our conversation went, I wanted to mention a book called The Bible With and Without Jesus by Mark Brettler and Amy Jill Levine. And this one really gets into questions around what we were talking about, folding things into the biblical text. Brettler and Levine are both Jewish scholars. Mark Brettler is a scholar of the Hebrew Bible. Amy Jill Levine is a scholar of the New Testament. And what they do is they take a couple of biblical passages that have been very important in Christianity or Judaism, and they do a historical critical reading, like what was it likely that this meant in the time when it was published, or composed, and then also what has this come to mean in Christian communities versus in Jewish communities. And it's a great way to show, just in an empirical way, how that sort of anachronistic folding in happens and how we come to bring very different things to the text that lead us to draw very different things out of the text based on what sort of communal religious stream we fit into. And so you can see these passages in the Hebrew Bible that, depending on whether your primary religious community reads the Old Testament through the lens of the New Testament and then the figure of Jesus, or reads it through developments in rabbinic Judaism, that you end up with very different interpretations in a way that I think anybody reading that will get some insights into sort of that none of these interpretations are really necessary in terms of this is the only possible interpretation of this text, that all of these texts can be and have been interpreted in a number of different ways. And you can then get a sense of the pliability of all of these texts in a way that's not too dense and really informative. So that's another great book that I recommend.
Thank you. Those are good. How about for fun? Are there books or podcasts or what? Yeah, no, I threw this in there because somebody didn't want to give me biblical scholars.
I read a lot for fun. If you go to my blog, you can find, I give a list of all the books that I've read in the previous year and then give some top picks. So that'll be coming out in December.
Okay.
And if I only include books on that list that I read cover to cover, so it's not there's a lot of stuff I read for research that I consult but don't necessarily read cover to cover. But I read a lot of science fiction, I read a lot of history, and I read a lot of it dances around questions of imagining possibilities for better worlds and trying to get there, and understanding history such that it can help us plot better trajectories forward in this world that we all live in and our kids have to live in after us.
What was the last science fiction that you read that you were really excited about?
So I just read, the most recent one that I read was The Power by Naomi Alderman.
Ooh, it's a tough read.
It is.
Yes.
every trigger and content warning, but it's powerful. And I think if there's a basic theme that comes out of that, it is power makes monsters. And that's something that I am pretty well convinced of in my interpretation of history and society. That one was good. It is tough. What else? I really enjoyed a book called The Children of Time, and I'm trying to remember the author's name.
Adrian Tchaikovsky.
Yes, Adrian Tchaikovsky.
I knew. You know what? I had an inkling that when I said what was the last sci-fi you were really excited about, that you were going to throw. Yes, those books.
Yeah, they're very good. Another one that I really enjoyed this year was R.F. Kuan's book entitled Babel or the Necessity of Violence, an Arcane History of the Oxford Translators' Revolution, which is, I just love those long throwback to the 18th century style titles, but it's also just a very good book.
It is a good book. That one was a tough read too. Not as tough as The Power, but so you are the second person to recommend that book on this podcast.
It's in a sense, it's good, and it's also academic catnip for people in the humanities, especially the sort of philological humanities. So it definitely hits buttons for us that are significant.
I will have links to those in the show notes. So unless you have anything else, I feel comfortable calling this one good.
No, that's great. Great. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for being here. Thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe and rate the podcast on your favorite platform. If you are interested in following, supporting, or engaging with the podcast anywhere else, check out the link tree that I've hyperlinked in the show notes. I try to put episodes out as soon as possible for $5 a month on Patreon. So if there's something that I've announced or you've seen on social media, just know $5 a month, you can listen to every episode that I have edited, and I try to get them up within a week of recording the conversation. Take care.